Is this on? Is this working? Hello, class. How are you today? I want to introduce myself. My name is Nelson Zane. That was the name my mother gave to me when I was born many years ago in Lithuania, and I'm glad to see you today. I'm sorry I cannot meet you in person. I have to apologize for my friend Pastor Mark. He told me he was not able to make it at the last minute, something about this hairdo, and he asked me to stand in and teach you the Old Testament, and I'm glad to do that. Good to see you. Good to see you today. He told me to tell you that he loves you and that he's, again, sorry he can't be with you. Now, what we are going to do today is talk about the Old Testament, and he said to make sure you have your sheet there that says Casket on it. Casket, empty, and we have a sheet that is for K, which stands for Kings. So we're going to talk about Kings of the Old Testament. Now, I know it may be tempting for you to press pause or to listen to this double time. Please don't. There's so much information. It's good. Listen to me in my normal voice, not chipmunk voice. Okay, please, Django. Now, Casket, K, Old Testament. I know it's tempting because the Old Testament, it's old. And, nobody likes old things, old movies, old food, old games, old people. Oh, no, maybe not old people. We all like old people. I'm an old people. But we don't like a lot of old things. And so it's easy for us to say, this is not going to be fun. And I understand that. But there are going to be some very valuable things. There are things that are essential for life, for flourishing, for you to know now from the Old Testament. So please, come with me on this journey. Okay, first of all, what is going on? What is this? Where is the erase? Okay. First of all, what is going on, if you remember from last time, is that God has taken his people, the Israelites, out of Egypt with who? Who is it? Who do you know? Yes, Jack. Moses. Very good. God has brought them out, and they have traveled through the wilderness because they whined and complained. Okay, that's a lesson to us right there, right now. No whining and complaining. Yes, it was hard. Absolutely. But don't whine and complain. Trust God. So God brought them through the wilderness into the land of milk and honey. I don't know if there was really milk and honey there, but probably maybe giant grapefruits and grapes and bananas. And he brought them into this land, and they were amazed and they were happy. But they had work that needed to be done, and Joshua helped them to do that, and they took the land by force because God commanded it. And they owned the land, and now all of a sudden they had all this land and all these people and these sheep and the goats, and they said, what do we do with it? And God gave them instructions, and he didn't just give them instructions on how to settle the land, but also how to rule the land, and most importantly, how to worship him in the land. That was the point, that they would worship him in the land that he had given them, the land of Canaan. So, that is where we are. Now they had a little bit of a problem because they were people, they were confused in this land and they didn't know what to do exactly. And God, in his mercy and his grace, he gave them something very important to help them rule with structure, but also mostly to worship. What is that? No, not kings. That's coming soon. Good guess. Priests. So, we write here, priests. God gave them priests. And these priests were important because they represented God to the people. They were in the middle, right here, priests. They were, if you would, you can write this down on your sheet there by priests. It says mediators. Mediators. For worship. God gave them priests. And actually, he gave them judges too, but we won't talk about that right now. Judges and priests as mediators of justice and worship. And you can read about this if you and please do in the books 1 Samuel all the way through Zephaniah. So that was their situation. God was faithful to them as he always is, and God gave them blessings beyond their greatest imagination, and he does the same thing for us. The problem is, we look at these things and we're like, we're not happy. We want more. This is not enough. So God looked at them and they said to him, we want more. And they looked at the nations around them. They were surrounded by other nations. And they looked at those nations and they thought, look how powerful. Look how cool. Look how beautiful their women are and handsome and strong their men are. What is the difference between us and them? How can we be better like them? We want to be like them. Do you ever feel that way? I do. And they realized. They put their minds together. No wisdom. But they said, we want a king. If we have a king, we will be better. We will be like the other nations. Cool and popular and beautiful and funny. So God said, that's not a good idea. No. It wasn't that God didn't want them to have a king. He was fine with them having a king. Matter of fact, God intended that they would have a king. A mighty king, an amazing king. But we'll get to that a little bit later. But now, God wanted them to trust him. But instead, they wanted to be like the other nations. God, give us a king. And God looked down and he said, if you want a king, it will not go well for you. But here, have a king. If you insist. See what happens. Learn. Learn the hard way. So he gave them a king. And their king's name was, does anybody know? Yes, Esme. Saul. Correct. That is correct. Saul. Write that down. Or it's already written down. But by Saul, write that he was a good king at first. But quickly he turned his eyes away from God. And he began to think he was amazing. He began to think of himself. He doesn't need to listen to the priest. He doesn't need to listen to God. He's got it under control. And he began to take his own advice, his own way. He disobeyed God without repentance. And he suffered. And the nation as a whole suffered. And God met with Samuel. See, Samuel was the priest. Samuel was a wise priest. And Samuel, write his name down, Samuel. 2 books from Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Samuel was the priest, and Samuel spoke to God, or God spoke to Samuel and said, I will provide another king. And the next king that came along, as you know, anybody got to guess? Yes. Isaac? David, correct. David was the next king, and David was a great king, powerful king. He did many good things, and the nation grew. Now, unfortunately, like Saul, David was a sinner as well. David was not perfect. Nobody is. Only one. But David came and he did many good things, but he made a big mistake. Several, but one major one. He looked on another man's wife and he saw that she was beautiful and he said, I'm going to take her as my own. And he did. And in doing that, he broke one of the main commandments of the Old Testament. Do you know what number it is? 6. He took, 7. 7, that's right. He took one of another man's wife for his own. And then he broke another commandment because he killed, the 6th, he killed the husband of that wife. David did this, a man after God's own heart. And you may think that, well, why didn't God take the nation away from David? Why did he allow him to still be king? Because Saul, he did not. What's the difference? David repented. David said, I'm sorry for what I've done. He repented because of the words of the priest. So David was king, and God, now here's what's important. There was a covenant, and you write that down. David, and then I want you to add an ick. David ick, covenant. God made a covenant with, first of all, Moses, and in relationships, there are covenants made, contracts, if you will, contracts with love. You know this, right? And those contracts of love, those covenants, communicate to the people that you are meant to be together. And God established a covenant, not many covenants, one covenant, but he renewed the covenant with David. It's very similar to the covenant that I have with my dear wife that is represented by this ring. Now, if I go out in the mud and dig around when I'm looking for worms, say, and my ring comes back and it's all dirty, I clean it off and make it like new. It's not new, but it's like new. So in the same way, when the covenant becomes dirty and old and dusty because they have forgotten and they have not obeyed it, God is not forgotten. And he enters into the relationship and renews the covenant. It's time for a snack break. I have some animal crackers here that my dear wife has provided for me. Okay. So those are the kings. Next, David has a son. His name is Solomon. Solomon is known for his wisdom. Ironically, it is the lack of wisdom that is the downfall of Solomon. Solomon is given the opportunity by God to have anything that he wants. Anything in the whole wide world, God says. You choose, you can have it. And he says, I want wisdom, which was a very wise thing to say. And God gave him wisdom and riches. But he makes an unwise decision, ironically, because of, I hate to say it, the same as his papa, because of women. Solomon takes wives from other nations, and that's not good. You should not take wives from other nations. Well, let me rephrase that a little. It's not exactly what I mean. We shouldn't take wives from other religions. God intends for his people to only take wives and husbands from the one true faith. So God tells Solomon this, and Solomon goes and he gets many wives, and some from other nations who do not worship the true God. They have their own idols, and because of that, Solomon begins to allow them to bring their idols into the land, and that causes problems. And Solomon, that is basically Solomon's downfall. So David, Solomon, and Saul, they're all sinners in need of God's grace. The difference is David repents and Saul does not. Why does God have mercy on David and not on Saul? It's because David repents. Solomon later is the downfall of his kingdom, his rule, but God is faithful to his people. Well, that is the period of time where the kingdom of Israel is united. Write this down. United kingdom. One kingdom, which is very good. Because united we stand and divided we fall. Correct. So, something happens which is very, very bad. And that is they get into a fight. The United Kingdom here becomes divided. Why? Because the kings begin to fight among themselves. They all believe that they have the right to the throne. But only God decides that. So they begin to argue. They begin to fight. Many are killed. Out. And the kingdom is divided into north and south. The northern kingdom is called Israel. Write it down there in Roman numeral number 2. And the south is called, anybody have a guess? Judah? Correct. Judah. That's the name, Judah. Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Two different nations, which have continue on for many, many years until both kingdoms are overthrown by the outsider. Now, why is that? Well, sometimes when I was a child in Lithuania, my mother would say, do not go into the wilderness alone without a knife, because there are many dangerous creatures out there. And you should always have an adult with you, a knife and an adult. But sometimes I would go and I couldn't find my knife because I laid it around somewhere and I couldn't find it, but I wanted to go into the woods. And so I'd be like, what could go wrong? And I would go into the woods, and you know what would happen? I would get attacked by a wolf. But that's okay because I beat that wolf down. Sometimes I would get scratched and, maybe mauled a little bit on my arm, but that was okay. Anyway, the point is this, that when we disobey God, there are consequences. Now, the difference is God brings those consequences himself. He doesn't just allow it, he causes it for our own good because he loves us, right? It's more like when you do something, when you disobey, surely you never do this. Your parents may say, no candy for you, no more candy. or no more internet for you, right? They're not doing that because they're mean. This is very important. It's not because they don't love you. They do. That is why they do it. They say, I have to take this away from you because I want you to learn and grow and mature and follow and trust me. Well, God does the same thing. He punishes them by allowing the outside land to come in order that they would realize the error of the ways and repent and turn to Him. And they do it. And God gives them, in order to help protect them from this, He gives them something so invaluable. And it's a resource that is made available to us today. And I long for you all to have it. And that is wisdom. Wisdom. I can't tell you enough, young men and young women, how important it is. My desire is for you that you would grow. The nation right now, the world is in turmoil. And there is going to be a day come when Pastor Mark and me and your parents will be in the graves. Our souls will be in heaven, but our bodies will be food for worms. And the world will be in your hands. And we long for you to be able to take the world that we live in, the brokenness, and to make it better until we get to heaven, to get us through hard times, or to survive when life is so tough, because it will happen. In order for us to do this, in order for you to do this, you must have the most valuable resource available to humanity, and it's wisdom, not the sword, not education. Those things are helpful, okay? It's not the internet. It's wisdom. Whatever you do, please, children, whatever you do, even if it costs you everything that you have, seek after wisdom. Plead for it. God says, if you ask, He will give it. Now, where does wisdom begin? Fear. But not fear of stuff. Not fear of people. Not fear of coronavirus. Fear of God. Live fearlessly. Live fearlessly, boys and girls. Young men and women. Live fearlessly in this world with only the fear of God. Okay. God gives them wisdom. And He gives it in the form of writing, and it's called the wisdom books. So God gave them priests. He gave them kings. But He also gives them wisdom that begins with fear. He also gives them writings that are given to you today. The wisdom books such as Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Proverbs. Read these things. They give us information to help us flourish in life. My father once told me when I was a wee little boy, he said, my son, if you want to be powerful, if you want to be strong, if you want to be liked, that's what I thought he was saying. What he was really saying, if you want to flourish in life, read a chapter of Proverbs every single day. And that's what I did. For many years I did that. I should get back to it, eh? So God gave them the books, Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, which is about love and sex. Anyway, talk to your parents about that. It's a little bit awkward. Anyway, pesky prophets. Now we get to the prophets. So wisdom, prophets. What is a prophet? Yes, a question. Oh, yeah. Jack, you have a question. Oh, very good question. Yeah, I don't know if in the north and the south, if their animals were divided as well. There's no writing about this in the ancient texts. I don't know, maybe the sheep in the north and the goats in the south. I don't know. Anyway, good question. You research. Tell us. Anyway, the prophets. The prophets were the ones who told God's people how to live rightly. Now that sounds very similar to the priests, correct? And they are very similar. Priest and prophet, very similar. Mediators between God and men. What's the difference? The difference is this. If I could summarize it this way. Write it down. The prophet was a mediator for worship, primarily. And that was a priest. Did I say prophet? Priest was a mediator for worship. And a prophet was a mediator for righteousness, morality, justice. Well, that was actually a judge. We didn't get into that, but they were also sent by God to keep the people on the right track. But the prophet was to give them the words from God on how to live rightly when they had drifted away. There were God's mercy. People like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, even Jonah. You know these stories. God sent them words to give to the people, to remind them, exhort them, warn them, to return to him. And if they would return, that he would continue to be their God and bless them. And in these writings, especially in the book of Isaiah, God told them that there would become a king one day who would restore the nation of Israel, because right now the nation, north and south, has been completely dilapidated and fallen and taken over by the enemy, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans eventually. And God has allowed this to happen. They cry out to him and he restores them eventually to some extent, but then he sends the promised Messiah. And that is who the prophets speak about. That one day he will send a prophet. And this prophet would fulfill the Davidic covenant. Okay, let's go back to that. This is very important. So if you go back to David, remember I told you about the Davidic covenant. What is the Davidic covenant? The Davidic covenant that God was reminding them of, that he was restoring like the ring that has gotten dirty. That Davidic covenant was a promise made to David that his line, his offspring, would be a king on the throne forever. Forever. Now, that's very curious, isn't it? Because it was a very small nation. But it said that there would be a king coming from the line of David who would sit on the throne, not just for 10 years, not 100 years, but forever. And of course, we know now that this is pointing God's people to a Messiah who would be a king. He would be a prophet because he would mediate righteousness. He would be a priest because he would mediate worship. But he would also be a king because he would bring justice. A prophet and a priest and a king is what the prophets pointed to from the line of David. And what we know in the New Testament, we jump forward into the New Testament. David's children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. One of them would be the king and still is the king, Jesus. And we need to look, whenever we're looking into the Old Testament, we want to look with the glasses of the New Testament. Look at the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. The Old Testament is speaking to us. It's speaking loudly. Are we listening? Are we hearing what it has to tell us about the New Testament? And what does the New Testament have to tell us about the Old Testament? They're talking to each other. And they're revealing to us God's brilliant plan of salvation for his people. And for us. For you, if you will trust him. Okay, so that is the prophets. Now, I won't go into all the details of the prophets. There's many things to say about the prophets. But I would just encourage you to look through them a little bit. I'll give you a few things to write down. Very few things. Okay. The Isaiah, write this. He was a prophet to the south. Now, which one is the south? Judah. He was a prophet to Judah, and he was a prophet of hope. And he was a prophet who spoke about the coming Messiah. So I would encourage you to read, if you will, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 9, chapter 52, chapter 53, chapter 56. It talks about the coming Messiah. Jeremiah, write this down. Jeremiah was a prophet to, guess, south. Correct. And he was a prophet preaching doom. He was known as the weeping prophet who told the people that there was going to be hard times ahead. Prophet who spoke of agony and the lack of obedience of God's people. It was a warning. It was the person who warned and says, watch out, hard times ahead. Be careful. Change your ways. That was Jeremiah. Then we have Jonah. If you remember the story of Jonah, he went to Nineveh. And he was a prophet to speak, not just to the nation of Israel. And it's important for us to remember that Israel was called to be a prophet to the nations. See, Israel, just like you have the prophet Jonah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Israel as a nation was a prophet to all the nations. That was the promise that was made to Abraham, that his children would be a nation of prophets to all the nations. Jonah was the representation of that. Jonah brought God's word to Nineveh, and they repented. So it could go on. Zephaniah, a prophet to the south. Habakkuk, a prophet to the south. And Elisha, if you remember, a prophet to the north. Anyway, these prophets were sent to encourage God's people to live rightly because he cared for them. He loved them. So children, young men and young women, please know that in the time of the kings, there was difficulty. There was trouble. And every time the nation of God drifted away from the path that God sought after them, he would allow them to go and experience their consequences for a time, but his intention was always to bring them back. And he would use a prophet. He would use a priest. He would use a king for that end. And when we look ahead in the New Testament, we see the same thing that God is doing for you and me today. That's the good news. That's the gospel. That God is using a prophet, a priest, and a king, and by the name of Jesus to draw us back to him. And not only that, he is the sacrifice. But that's a whole nother story for another day. Anyway, by way of homework, Pastor Mark, he told me, I think we'll finish there, but he told me to have you read, if you will, any one of the prophets. Anyone. Any of the prophets. And write one thing down that you think that points from that prophet to God's mercy. Okay, that's your homework. Continue to work on your Casket timeline. And with that in mind, I think we will say goodbye. Arrivederci. Blessings to you on your day. Be safe. Be calm. God is on his throne.